welcome back to my sewing room. If you're new, my name's Diane and I like to share with you the story of the quilts that I've made. And this week I would like to share with you a traditional design, a trip around the world. It's quite an easy way of putting a quilt together using lots of different pieces of smaller fabric if you have them. And my intention was to make a scrappy trip around the world. But all that changed. When I started making it, it completely altered. And so I will share the process of my thoughts as I went through making that quilt. But first of all, I'd just like to talk about two other things first. First of all is fabric recommendations. Now recently I have been buying fabric from Rainbow Fabrics, which is a dead stock company here in the UK, and where I can I will show the selvage edge of the fabric so that you can see them. Recently I purchased some fabric that was called calico, and it was from Joann's. Now Joann's is a company in America. I think it's in closure at the moment, I'm not absolutely sure. However, one of you lovely viewers, commented and said, be very careful about using red calico fabric from Joann's as the colours could run. Well, the reason this person commented was because I just finished this beautiful Irish chain, double Irish chain in a red, white and blue fabric. So the white fabric I bought here in the UK and I'd used before, so I knew that the colour fastness of that was okay, but I had used Joann's blue and the red. Now I'm not affiliated to Rainbow Fabrics in any way, but if I am putting a salvage out there, it is a sort of advertisement, I suppose, and I was worried in case people out there would go and buy that fabric and the colour would run. And also I had put it in a quilt, the front and the back, which I thought looked beautiful, but then I was really concerned about this colour run. And so I decided to pre-wash that quilt before I've sent it off to its new owner. And the product I used, if you're in the UK, is called Dylon. And it's called Renew, and it's supposed to help with colour fastness. So I use that in the wash. It is for sensitive skin as well. Part of the reason I don't like to pre-wash my quilts is I'm never quite sure. I use 100% cotton batting and fabrics in the main, but I am a bit aware of people's sensitivity. So this is for sensitive skins, because I'd hate to send a product out to the world and someone have a reaction to it. And I also put in a couple of colour catchers. So if you're not aware, a colour catcher is it's just like, it's magic really how it works. It's a little bit of paper and you put those in, and the idea is that the colour, if it was to leach out of the fabric, would go into that rather than the lighter fabrics in the product, and catch them to stop the colour run. And it works. I don't know why it works, but it works. So I just wanted to explain, really clarify that about the calico fabrics from Joann's before I go on to the next part, which is another comment from somebody called Julie who's watched, and she's interested in the way that I work out the dimensions, the maths behind the quilts I design. Now I've tried to make it as simple as possible to explain. The process is simple. To try and explain it sometimes can be a little bit tricky. I used to be a teacher, and that is what fascinated me about teaching, is the way that people approach problems, often logical problems, in completely different ways. And maths is one of those areas that people come at it from lots of different ways. And so I'm going to explain to you the way that I design my quilts, and I work out the size of the blocks so they all fit together. For me, it seems quite simple because that's the way the logic in my brain works, but I'll go on to that now. So if you're interested, I'll explain that. And also it feeds into the way that I make my trip around the world quilt. Again, there are lots of different ways of putting one of those quilts together, trip around the world. And the way I do it, it's quite simple. It is 3-inch blocks, but you could use any size blocks you wanted to complete your trip around the world. But it's putting smaller blocks together. There are other ways of putting strips together, and I'll touch on those briefly. But I'm just going to go and put the fan on. Excuse me a minute. So I'm going to refer back to this double Irish chain, the design that I made for that. And if you have a look at this graph paper in front of you, you can see that there are lots of little squares. Well, in my mind, each of those squares is worth 3 inches. It's a 3-inch square. So if you have a look over where it says block A, and you look below that, you'll see a single square, and you can see that I want 52 of those. If you have a look to the right of that, you'll see that there is a rectangle, and that is 3 squares across and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares down, and you can see that I've labelled that 8 inches by 13 inches, and so there's still 3-inch squares, but I have allowed for the 1/4 inch seam allowance on each of those squares. So if you take 2 3-inch squares and you sew them together, so there's one seam, you're going to lose 1/4 inch on each side. So you're losing 1/2 inch overall. So if you have a look at this chart in front of you, I have made myself a little ready reckoner, and I've called it multiples of 3-inch squares. And so you can see number 1, it's a 3-inch square. Then when I join 2 together, allowing for that seam allowance, it becomes 5.5 inches. When I join 3 together, I'm only adding 2.5 inches every time. So 2.5 inches added to 5.5 is 8 inches. And so if I want a strip that would cover the graph paper over 4 of the squares, I know that the length I'd need would be 10.5 inches. And on this page, you can see at the bottom that I've gone from 25 down to 30. And so that gives me the width of a quilt. So if my quilt was going to be 30 squares deep, then I know that quilt would measure 75.5 inches. So sometimes when I get the graph paper out, I have a rough idea of the size of the quilt I want to make. So sometimes I might put boundary lines. So if I was to make a 63-inch square quilt, I know I'd need to have 25 blocks down one side, 25 across the top, and then I just have to fill in inside of that boundary. And then if you have a look at this design of the double Irish chain, that's all I did. I just made those block A, block B on the graph paper, and then I worked out the dimensions. In that particular quilt, I decided that instead of having 2 5x5 blocks, which is a 13-inch square block, that block B would have a rectangle down the middle, and I wanted to keep that as intact as possible, that space, because I had a feature print that I wanted to preserve. And so I hope that helps Julie and anybody else that wants to have a go. So let's get back to this trip around the world quilt. So recently I bought a couple of books from the charity shops. I bought this one, An Amish Quilts, and they refer to it as Light and Shade, that trip around the world design. And I also bought another book which also had a trip around the world quilt on their front cover. And so I thought, I know that in my process square box it was beginning to get quite big, and it's there, and you can see it's getting big again. and intentionally so this time, because I wanted to make this trip around the world block quilt in a real scrappy way. Unfortunately, that all went to pot when I started selecting fabric, and I'll explain that. But before I do that, I'll just talk about a couple of ways that you can put this trip around the world quilt together. So there's another popular way that you can make these trip around the world quilts. So you can take strips of fabric. So if you were going to use 3-inch squares, you would take 3-inch strips of fabric, sometimes width of fabric, and you sew them all together, and then you put those right side together, sew the top and the bottom together to form a tube, and then you slice those down the tube, and then you unpick where you want your fabric to start to lie. So if you're going to say your fabric strips were black on the top, you would unpick on the top of the black, that would be your start of your strip, and then on the next tube you would unpick the square below, so that forms that sort of diagonal line. I don't really like to use that method, because sometimes when you're slicing, sometimes the fabric can move, you're going over lots of seams, and I don't get quite the accurate squares afterwards that I would like. So that's just my preference. I prefer not to use that way. But in this book that I recently bought, there's another method, and I'll show you that. So basically you would start in that center and you would cut down each side, and it's flat. So that does eliminate it being in a tube, but you've still got all of those seams to cover. So I prefer to do the 3-inch squares. So I took out my box with 3-inch coloured squares in. You can see they're sort of in a colour family, and I started looking at those. There wasn't enough to make a whole quilt, and so I thought I'll have a look at smaller pieces of fabric that I have. So I had this beautiful red heart by Robert Kaufman in my container, and I thought I would love to use that in a scrappy trip around the world quilt. And then I found this beautiful dragonfly piece of fabric by Bethany Salt, and I really liked that. And then I found this beautiful dragonflies by Bethany Salt. I mean, it's such a beautiful fabric, isn't it? How could I not use that? And then I found this small piece of Enchanted Wings by Bethany Salt. And then I found I also had some odd fat quarters in that collection. I decided that I didn't need to create a design for this trip around the world quilt. And so I've got 4 quadrants, and I decided that the blocks I would use would be in 12 different colours, and so each of those quadrants are going to be 12 squares deep, 12 squares across. And so you can see I need 4 corners, and then I've got 4 strips, one in the middle top, middle bottom, and then one on the left middle, right middle, and then there'll just be one little square in the centre. And you can see on the bottom here that I have made a note that it was 12 by 3-inch squares. That would give me a square of 30.5 inches. Remember, there's the sashing pieces to join those, and I would need for each row, if I'm going to have 12 different pieces of fabric to complete the whole of that quilt, I would need 52 3-inch squares. And I did have a couple of fat quarters left in those fabric designs, and I'd worked out that I needed 1.5, just over, fat quarters to enable me to get 52 3-inch squares from it. So, and the way I organise my pieces to complete this quilt is, in this situation I wanted to have 12 different colours, and so I decided I would have 3 rows with 4 different colours in. The end row of each colour would be a neutral, so that was going to be an off-white or a cream on the far right. The first set of blocks in each row would be the darkest fabric. The middle set of blocks would be a bright fabric, and then the third row of blocks would be a medium colour fabric. All of those blocks sets are of the same fabric design except for the pink. So you can see now at this point, can't you, that this scrappy quilt with all those spare blocks is no longer scrappy. It's all Bethany salts. In the main, it's Bethany salts. And the only colour blocks that weren't Bethany salts were those pinks. And I just thought that might be a little bit odd when everything else matched. And so I decided that I would go into my stash and have a look for some fabric yardage just to make up those 52 3-inch squares in one colour. And so I had a look to see what I had, and I chose these 3 as a selection. So first of all, I put that orangey fabric, the leaf fabric, in the centre, and I thought that worked well. It tied in with all of the colours. And then I put this beautiful Robert Kaufman in the centre, that pink. And I liked that pink because it was a contrast to the orange, and also there are tiny bits of pink in those other fabrics, and it sort of lifted the whole thing. And to be honest, I was really leaning heavily towards that Robert Kaufman. But then I tried this lovely pink with the white dots on, and it just sort of sparkled. It worked so much better in my opinion. And so I decided I would go with the pink. Then I added the neutrals, and that was my fabric selection complete. But if you want to work using my method, you have to have a place where you can put your fabric out and make sure that it's not disturbed, because I'm going to work from that, and it's very, very sort of mindful sewing. If it's calm and on the side, all I do is I take one block, I join it to the block on the right, and I just keep going until I've used all of those 12, joining always from the right, and then I have one strip of 12 and I put that on my design board. So I made 4 of those rows of 12, so that's the sashing complete, and I put those up on my board. And you can see I started with the dark, that was the middle section on the top. That is reversed on the bottom, so the dark is at the very bottom, and then on the left the dark is far left, and on the right the dark is far right. So it all comes to the centre with that cream. That's how it finishes. I do need a centre block, but that is my guidelines. And the only thing you need to remember with this method of working is that you always start the next row on the fabric that you finished with. So that first row I finished on a cream, so that means that I will start the next row on a cream. And the cream that I finished on was on the bottom right hand corner, and so I will take a cream from that, and then the colour that I will join to that is the beetle on the top row, and then I will just work all the way along, joining blocks from the right until I get to the very bottom, and on that row I will finish on a blue. So you can see on the image on the left hand side the blue is in the center, and so on the right hand side you can see my next row I started with that blue, and then I moved to the right cream, and then I went back to the top row. So always starting on the same block that I finished the last row on, always working to the right. And I made sure that I always completed 4 rows each time. So I would put 2 rows along the top and 2 rows on the bottom. Don't have to worry about sides. The sides are being formed as the rows are coming together. And when I said that I managed to get 52 blocks of the same design for each pile. Not quite true. The very first block I started with, the first pile, is a black background with pinks and a blue beetle on. Unfortunately, I only had 48 of those, so I was 4 short. And so I thought, well, I'll use a black background. So it was a tone on tone black, and I thought that would tie in with the background of that block. And so that's the one I started with. So on those first 4 sashing strips, I start with a black. Unfortunately, I didn't like that. I didn't think it worked as well as I hoped it would, and so it kept playing on my mind, and so I pinned everything up. I wouldn't join anything until I was just 100% certain that that could stay. It didn't. So those black squares kept playing on my mind, and one day I came in and I sat on my table and I just looked at the design wall, and it suddenly occurred to me that that beetle square was in each corner. It formed the cornerstone of the whole quilt. So I thought, if I take that corner out and put that on the top of and the bottom and the left and the right, that would finish off that diagonal, meet that, and that would work much better. And I could put that black in each corner, which I thought would be less noticeable. And so I did that, and I was much happy with that. I thought that worked much better. And then I could focus on that central block where everything meets. And I decided that I would use a navy blue with that beautiful dragonfly, and I would fussy cut one of those as best I could in 3 inches, and I would put that in the centre of the quilt. And then I realised I did have enough of the blue squares that I could replace the black background in the corners with, because I really love this fabric, and I just thought I would rather have a colour out of sequence that was the same coloured fabric used elsewhere in the quilt than introduce a new black. So once I'd made my mind up to use that blue dragonfly in the corners, everything just seemed to work much better, and I was happy to sew it together. So all I did was work in the quadrant. So I started in the top left hand, the outside strip, took that one and I joined it going across all the way until I came to the centre piece, that sashing piece, and I just put a little row of stay stitching around the edge of the completed quadrant, just to make sure that those seams didn't pop. So I had the top half of the quilt complete, and then I worked my way across the bottom in the same fashion and joined the whole thing together. And I didn't mention earlier, but some of the images are directional, so having it pinned on the wall in that way, I know it's a luxury, not everybody has got the space to do that, and so I did try and make sure that where images were directional, that they are facing the right way. So peacocks are standing on their feet and not on their head. And I usually put a row of stay stitching or a lap of honour around the quilt, because especially when there's lots of seams on the outside, and I just pressed it all and put it aside for a little while, and I waited for the temperatures to drop. I had this beautiful wide back fabric in my stash for a while, and I just thought that I could use this on the back because it's got sort of a floral, it's a navy blue background, there's a lot of navy on the front, and also all this lovely bird and the butterflies. It just seemed to work together, and so I used that. And in this hot weather, you just can't do big projects one after another. And so I basted the quilt, and then the next day I came into my sewing room and I quilted it on my sewing machine. And I used my favoured cross hatch, and I think that works really, really well on a traditional quilt like A Trip Around the World. And when I looked at it, I thought that actually this quilt could be reversible if people wanted to use this top as the quilt, they could definitely do so. And I added my little label, and I didn't really want to spoil the design on the back by having it in a prominent place on the navy blue, and so I did sew my label over the top of this big flower, and from a distance you can't see it, so if people do want to use it reversed, they can. And that's the story of this trip around the world quilt. Not as scrappy as I first hoped it would be. I have got all of those red Robert Kaufman squares cut up, ready to go for a trip around the world quilt, but it suddenly dawned on me that I could make a beautiful scrappy trip around the world quilt. Same dimensions, a strip of 12, but I could do rainbow colours repeated, so 6 rainbow colours, 6 rainbow colours to make the 12 strip, and lots of different scrappy squares. That's my intention. We'll see how that goes. So I'm going to leave you now with a shot of the finished quilts in my garden, and I hope you have enjoyed this longer video. So if you have bought any of that calico from Joann's, I suggest that perhaps you wash it in cool wash with those sorts of safety measures, and you'll be fine. And also, I hope, Julie, some of that maths is okay. Comment, leave me questions if you want to. So enjoy your quilting, whatever you do, whether you follow your own patterns or improv quilting or other people's, just enjoy the process. Take good care of yourself. Bye.